Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we've got 18 attendees. It's almost 5 after 10, and we think this can be a really rich conversation and discussion. So why don't we dive in? My name's Marco. I am your host, if you will, your facilitator today for the discussion. A quick set of logistics and some introductions. If you want to tweet as we are meeting today, the hashtag, as you'll see on some of the slides, is niche leadership. And be sure to tag us as well at nychonline if you're tweeting. In terms of our flow for today, Shelley Zuckerman will introduce niche. In case you're not familiar with our pronunciation, you'll hear North York Community House referred to by its acronym as niche, quite typically. Shelley, Bonnie, and Jin will present for about 30 minutes. And during this time, we're going to disable the chat, and we're going to encourage you to post questions in the Q&A section as they come up. We'll use those to help start the discussion, which will happen after all three presentations are done. You'll be able to see other people's questions as they're posted, comment on them, as well as upvote them. And this could be useful if someone else asks a question that you might also have. Instead of duplicating and re-asking that question, you can simply add a vote that suggests to us that it's also of interest to you, and that can help us to do some of the Q&A moderation after. The presentations will be recorded, but the discussion will not be recorded. We want you to feel comfortable having an open group discussion after the presentations, and we really want this to be that, a discussion more than just a Q&A session or a question and answer session. During the discussion, I'll do the moderating, beginning with questions that you've posted in the Q&A. And at that time, I'll ask you if you want to unmute yourself to ask your question directly, as well as to have further chat or interactions with our presenters. And once you're unmuted, you can ask your question, you can make a comment, and you can engage with the panel and others attending. So we'll play with that a little bit. We think it should work well. You're welcome again to unmute yourself to show your video or to simply post your questions via text. And our goal today is to be done by 11:30. The recording of the presentation will be available to everyone after. But like I said, the discussion won't be recorded. So for now, I'd like to hand it over to the niche Executive Director, Shelley Zuckerman, for a land acknowledgement and introduction to niche.
Thank you, Marco. I want to start just with a land acknowledgement. We at North York Community House acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. In the spirit of reconciliation, we honor Indigenous histories, worldviews, and cultures, and acknowledge the enduring presence of First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit people. Doing our land acknowledgement is our way of respecting and honoring the traditional caretakers of the land we are on. We recognize the importance of bringing awareness of Indigenous histories to our staff and community members in order to begin a journey to learn more about truth and realities of Indigenous experiences in Canada, past and present. We hope this moves us towards relationship building and reconciliation that is defined by Indigenous people and communities. I think most of you know North York Community House, but just in case you don't, we're a multi-service neighborhood center in the northwest part of Toronto, and have two major pieces of work and focus. One is assisting newcomers to settle, thrive, and belong in Canada and in Toronto. And the second one is supporting civic engagement and community development in the communities that we work in. So we're really, really pleased to have you today on our webinar. As Marco mentioned, we see this as an opportunity to have a conversation with our colleagues, to share our experiences at Niche during this time, and to hear your experiences and to learn together. I'm joined in presentations by two members of our senior leadership team, Bonnie Hunter, who's our Director of Talent and Culture, and Jin Ha, who is our Program Director. So I'm going to turn it back to Marco because we have a poll for you.
Thanks, Shelley. We wanted to ask a quick question of folks here today, just in terms of how your organization is doing. Really quickly, do you feel your organization is surviving, like barely getting by after these last few months, that you're striving, that you're starting to focus on medium-term goals, that you're feeling like you're recovering? Or are you thriving, that you're working towards ambitious long-term goals already? So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to make your selection, to give us a sense of where you're at as a community here today. Okay, so 15 out of 19 have voted. That's okay. If you don't want to share with us your situation, that's okay. I'm going to end the poll and share that with you. So right now we've got 2 who are in survival mode, 8 who are striving, and 5 who are thriving. So a really interesting mix. So about over 50% are striving right now, and I think that's good information for us as we move forward, as well as to facilitate the discussion. So I'm going to hand it back to Shelley now, and she'll start her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Marco. So I'm going to talk about 4 lessons that I've learned over the past couple months. And these are lessons that I think are important to keep in mind as we move into the next phase. So the first lesson for me is the need for an experimentation and learning mindset. If you can do the next slide. I think it's really important, even though we're in a really horrible pandemic and there's some really negative impacts for all of us and often especially for the communities that we serve, I think it's still important to look for the opportunities that may arise during that time. And in order to do that, we need a learning and experimentation mindset. There are opportunities now to experiment and try out new things. There's opportunities to engage our communities differently, provide different services, and find new ways of leading. And really, right now, why don't we try them out? Because everything is new and different. No one has the answers. So really, all we are doing right now is experimenting. And so given that we are experimenting, I think it's really a good idea to push our experimentation even a little further during this time. Because really, failure isn't such a big deal right now. We're in a pandemic, and I don't really think it matters that much if one of our programs that we've tried doesn't work, or we have technical difficulties, or no one shows up to our webinar. So I've really encouraged our staff and our management team to try out new ways of doing our work during these times. And one example that I want to tell you about is a webinar that our frontline staff did last Friday. And six members of our frontline staff organized with our support a webinar to talk about the work they're doing and the lessons that they've learned and how they've adapted their programs. It was a great success. Over 150 people from all over Canada joined, and they felt really good about their presentations and about the work they do, and they're really now encouraged to experiment a little more. So really, in terms of this time, we really need to think about what is the new normal that we want to see, and to really re-examine our organizations, our services, and how we work. And for me, the question is, how can we take a critical look at what we will and what we should change, and how we might work differently as we do that? The second lesson for me is the importance of communication. We found it really important that there's regular communication by myself and by the senior leadership team. And as communications experts say, we can't over-communicate, and we've really found that to be true. One of the things we did, which we found really useful, was to identify the critical messages that we wanted to communicate right at the beginning, and to repeat these messages often. So some of the messages that we've identified were things like, we're all in this together. This is a time for experimentation and learning. this is a difficult time and you need to take care of yourselves, and we want to help you do this. You're doing a great job. We also found that it's really important to be transparent and often a little vulnerable. And I want to tell you a quick story about that. When we started working remotely, the first week, every day after, at the end of the day, I would send a message to staff, an update to staff. There was so much information to be communicated at that time. And about a week and a half into the pandemic, there was a day that was a tough day for me, and I just thought, there's no way I can do this update. I'm just gonna miss a day. And I mentioned it to a senior management colleague, and she said, why don't you just send a message out saying that you've had a bad day? And I thought, that's a good idea. So I did that, quick message, I'm having a tough day, just want to acknowledge it. This is what I'm trying to do to help myself, and we all have these bad days. And it was really quite amazing because that evening I got so many emails from staff telling me that they were thanking me for being open and honest, sharing with me some of their difficulties, and just appreciating the update. And so since then, for the next 8 weeks, every day after, at the end of the day, I would do an update to staff. And sometimes it was filled with information. Sometimes it was just a quick message thanking them. Sometimes it was talking about myself. Sometimes it was telling them to have a great weekend and to relax and take time off. And it was really pretty, and I continue to get emails and messages from staff thanking me for the emails, letting me know that they really feel it's helpful. And several said that they actually look forward to my emails every day. And what I didn't realize, as I've been getting those emails from staff, is actually how much staff have supported me in this time. So that was a really important lesson for me. And as we move forward, I'm hoping that I can continue as we move back into the office, and that can continue to communicate regularly with staff. Perhaps not every day, but find ways to communicate and continue to be vulnerable and transparent with them. My third lesson is prioritizing technology and having a technology plan. I don't think I'm a typical baby boomer when it comes to technology. I've been interested in the past few years in how we can use technology more effectively, how we can use social media to engage with communities, and ways that we can provide some of our programs online. And as a result, I've been prioritizing technology, both hardware and software, in terms of online programs and platforms, and really trying to push Niche's online presence, and also look at some programs that we can do online. And we obviously didn't expect it, but it's now paying real dividends. What I found is that our staff was able to pivot to working online and working remotely quite quickly. And even the staff that did have some difficulty with technology, who didn't feel as comfortable using some of the platforms and going online, there was enough staff who were comfortable with technology that they can help them and support them. But we still have work to do. As we start doing more in-person services, we know that some of our participants will want or need to continue to be served online or in some hybrid model. And so the question and for me, and what we need to figure out, if you can go to the question, thanks, is how do we take our lessons learned and really up our game? And how can we even more effectively use technology creatively and innovatively, and build the hybrid programs that we know that we'll need as we get ready for this new normal. And the fourth lesson is it's amazing how agile we can be when there are no alternatives. As I mentioned, we literally went from one day providing almost all our services in person to the next day providing almost everything online. And we went from the senior management team really encouraging and pushing our staff to try some online programs to everybody doing it because we had to. And we did it. And staff and frontline staff with the organization, managers' support, adapted and tried out different ways of providing service, different platforms, different ideas. And they realized how adaptable and agile they can be, and they've taken pride in this. So when everything's moving so quickly, they also realized how quickly they can adapt. So for me, a really key question is, how do we ensure that this adaptability and this agility continues when we move to the new normal and start returning to our offices? And what do we need to put in place? And what do we need to do to ensure that it continues? So those are my 4 lessons. I'd like to turn it over to Bonnie now for her to share her experiences. Thanks.
Thanks, Shelley, and hi, everyone. Really happy that you're all here. I want to talk a little bit about leadership because it became clear really early on in the pandemic, even before the lockdown, that both our function and people's perceptions and needs in terms of senior leadership had changed, partly because we were in this new situation that we'd never faced before, and we were making decisions based on information that was changing minute by minute. So we were in that real crisis management mode for the first few weeks. And our typical role as problem solvers was suddenly limited. So usually we're used to relying on strategies and approaches to dealing with obstacles that come up. And we're pretty creative at finding alternatives to resolve things. And we've certainly shown that in terms of how we've been able to serve the community in different ways. But this is a bigger problem. This is something we can't fix. And so that problem-solving function has shifted a little bit, and our capacity to do that has shifted. This was brought home to me by one of my team members who was talking about the stress she was experiencing, and I immediately went into problem-solving mode and said, let's talk about, how to prioritize your work and how to move things around. And she said, yeah, that's great, but a lot of this is stuff I have to do myself. I have to figure out how to cope with this. And I realized in the moment it seems incredibly obvious, but that listening was the biggest tool and support that I could provide. And so part of the lesson for me has been stepping out of that immediate problem solving and giving people space to just process what's happening. As people have been saying, we're not in the same boat, and that this situation has impacted people in many, many different ways and at different levels, but we are all in the same storm. And so this is a different characteristic too, in that as leaders, we're dealing with a lot of the same struggles and challenges that our teams are, our community members are, in terms of the reality that we're currently facing. And so in terms of what our teams needed from us, it became evident early on that they really needed that personal connection. So to use the storm analogy a little more, they wanted to know we weren't just steering the ship. We weren't just taking care of things at an organizational level and supporting them and giving them what they needed in terms of doing their jobs and serving the community. But they really wanted an acknowledgement that we get it. We're dealing with a lot of the same things. We have a lot of the fears that they do. And as Shelley pointed out, one of the messages that she sent out that really connected with people the most was when she said, I'm having a bad day. And people really appreciated hearing that. So we found that, a lot of times when you log into a Zoom meeting, people take a few minutes and they have sort of chit chat as everyone's getting connected. And that's great. But we really need to be more intentional about how we connect with people in different ways. So part of it is through meetings, but we also need informal spaces to make those connections and support people. We can do it through groups, but we also need one-to-one time. I've had so many times when someone's emailed me about a work issue, and I've emailed back and also just said, how are you doing? How's your family doing? And people really, really respond to that. We need to find a balance between recognizing the reality that we're in, acknowledging the accomplishments. Our teams have been amazing in terms of how they push themselves to be creative, and how it's been important to recognize that, and then to be somewhat inspirational and honest about what's yet to come. So there's a lot we don't know, but it's really looking forward and figuring out how we're going to move forward together. We recently did a staff survey, and it was no surprise to us that people want to continue this level of connection. Part of what we've experienced, and Shelley mentioned this, is this two-way support. She was talking about how supported she felt by staff. And I think for a lot of us, the challenge is learning to receive that support. Again, allowing ourselves to be open and a bit vulnerable. So, you know, when I say to my staff, when are you taking time off, and how are you taking care of yourself? I immediately get back, well, when are you taking time off, and how are you helping yourself? So it's really being receptive to that, and allowing us to take care of each other. So going forward, we want to continue where people can just get together and talk about anything, not work related, just how people are doing has changed as we bring new people in, and try to help them figure out part of the team when you can't sit down and have a coffee with them. And now more than ever, the way we support our Black staff and volunteers has become a huge priority. And again, the challenge of doing that when you're not in the same room together. So really it's about intentionally creating space in lots of different ways to connect and support our teams. I want to talk just a little bit about agility, and Shelley talked about this. And it's been certainly shown that we can do that in terms of our programs and services. But as we saw governments and funders really flatten their bureaucratic process, it sort of begs the question, one, why can't they do that all the time? But also, how can we do that? And how can we make our internal processes easier and more efficient? So there are ways that I think we can remove barriers for staff while still being compliant and doing our due diligence. Fortunately, we had already moved our HR and finance functions in terms of what staff need online, so that gave people more access and autonomy. But now we're doing a policy review, and it's about more than just the content of the policy and what legislation's changed. It's really about the language. You know, most of our policies contain a ton of legalese, and to get us to translate our policies for them. So it's looking at what can we do, what's not needed anymore, how can we strip them down. Again, keeping those pathways of communication between staff and senior management open, so there are a few layers. People don't have to wait for monthly meetings to share their ideas and solutions and concerns. We also want to review our decision-making and authorization processes so that we can make space in people's different roles for innovation and experimentation. So it's really about more doing and less planning. We have a mental health resilience group that has been doing a ton of different things to support staff. They held a movie night, and it was not successful. It turns out people don't want to get together and sit in silence for 2 hours. They really want to be able to talk to each other. So, you know, that was a great learning, but the whole point is they want to keep trying different initiatives and see what sticks instead of taking weeks to perfect a particular thing before rolling it out. So it really is that doing versus planning thing. So that's all for me, and I'm going to hand it off to Jen.
Thanks, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us this morning. So as a program director, I sit at an interesting intersection where I can see a high-level view across the organization, across all our programs and services. And on a daily basis, I'm able to look to some extent, both up and down the organization and in and out. And for me, that feels like a very privileged position. It also means I have a lot of responsibility to make connections across systems. and it means I get easily distracted. So one thing that has helped me prioritize my efforts has been to identify what are the questions that guide me on a daily basis. So I'm going to share 3 sets of questions and some actions we have taken around them and some lessons learned. So the first set of questions are around how is this pandemic affecting us? How is it affecting us differently? And how can we enable ways to address it within communities and with staff? So some of the things that we've tried are to communicate a very clear shared vision, strategy, and set of values in our programs and in our response that's centered around vulnerability and equity, and being very clear about that. Doing our best to understand the nuances and the complexities of vulnerability and economics. So how do we understand what people are facing in all their complexities? So for example, how does immigration status, precarious work situations, family status, and racism and anti-Black racism all impact an individual's experience of COVID-19? And we're also aiming for a rapid rate of response as best as we can, and Bonnie talked quite a bit about this, finding concrete ways to address challenges that we learn about and doing that as quickly as possible. So we don't have the luxury anymore to overthink our responses now. So we've been trying our best to fill in gaps in knowledge, address tech issues, both amongst staff and in the community, find concrete resources to meet people's needs as quickly as we can. And it may not be perfect the first time around, but let's do what we can, and then let's also try to keep doing better. The other thing I find that's been important is to communicate to staff that we're aiming here to meet needs, regardless of targets, program eligibility criteria, and to some extent even job description. So some areas where there's room for improvement and learning around here, or in this area, is around data collection. So much room for improvement there, really. And then also in engaging in policy change and advocacy around key areas of vulnerability. So being able to respond more effectively, not just at an individual or group level. So the next set of questions are around how do you support and motivate people, and specifically staff, towards a shared vision and approach? And how do you sustain them for the long haul? And so for us, this is about the fact that staff are niche's most valuable resource. And this is about staff mental health, staff feeling valued and motivated, and it's about work-life balance. So to achieve this, I think it's important to name the moment as it truly is, as best as you can, and addressing the shared reality that what's out there is also in here, that we are all struggling, and that many of us are experiencing a lot of the things that community members are experiencing. And as leaders, I think it's really important to foster a workplace environment and relationships that are grounded in trust. So focus on results and impact and not on micromanaging or policing hours. And the starting point being assuming the best in people and going from there. I think both Shelley and Bonnie have talked about over-communicating supports for staff. So maintaining all kinds of frequent communications with managers and with team members, so you know how people are doing and you're following up with them accordingly. And creating supports and over-communicating around mental health, dealing with stress, strongly encouraging people to take time off, following up with people one-on-one, and naming how people are dealing with different levels of burden. So people feel seen, that you see those single parents and how they're struggling, that there are many of our staff members who have family overseas that are stuck overseas or sick overseas. And so we see them and know that they're struggling in unique and challenging ways. It's also important to help foster a culture of mutual aid within the organization, create multiple feedback loops and access to decision makers, and to celebrate our successes in lots of different ways, sharing stories, follow-up emails, sharing stories on social media. So some areas where there's room for improvement around these questions are walking the talk in terms of the management team. We're not always good at following our own advice. Connecting with the quiet staff. We tend to hear from the same staff regularly, and then there's lots of staff that we don't often hear from, so going out of our way to check in with them. And how to continue to provide space for critical feedback. You know, I think we've been fairly good about that, and then as the organizational story becomes about success, it might be harder for people to feel comfortable talking about the critical feedback, and it's important for us to continue to listen and create spaces for that. So the next set of questions, the final set of questions, are around what do we need to see and what do we need to do to address, and what do we need to address across the system? what connections need to be made between, for example, urgent needs now and challenges that will exist in the future. And not just challenges, but also what is the future that we want to build? How can we address both individual and community and systemic needs and barriers? What are the connections that we must make, and what assets can we share across different programs and service areas and across different sectors and issues? So this is a complex one. So here's a few things I will say on this for now. One, it's clear that crisis fosters collaboration and the breaking of silos. And so we've done our best to build on this momentum and increase our collaboration and our collaborative thinking across programs within niche and with partners outside of niche. We've been trying to find ways to see patterns across these different systems, across issues, communities, and needs, and to be able to see both the individual trees and the bigger forest. We've been trying to put in place ways to better enable the transfer of knowledge across the system, to deal with the rapid pace of change, and to support everyone to come along in understanding what all the changes are. And one of the things we want to do more is to do that through storytelling. We're constantly trying to frame our urgent response in the context of community engagement and systems change as well. So for example, showing up for people in need, providing them with the one-on-one services that they need, while also asking, how can we build upon community assets? How can we support resident leadership and support mutual aid networks to thrive? There's always been a bit of a divide between our settlement services that typically focus on individual needs and our community development and systems change work. And there are a lot of lessons learned through this pandemic on how to integrate the two more fully. So some areas for improvement and learning around this, well, all of it. This is really, really complex work. What's happening around the world and in Toronto, how Black communities are disproportionately and negatively impacted before and during COVID-19, figuring out what our role is in combating this. There's so many complex questions that we're thinking through. Lots of work needs to go into this. So we're finding success, and also there's so much more work we need to do. There's so much uncertainty and no clear answers. And so it's important to create opportunities for us to ask questions and talk at a strategic level and learn from each other. So I'm looking forward to doing that with all of you.
Thank you, Jin. That sounds like a great segue to move into our discussion. We don't have any questions in the Q&A. I'm going to reopen the chat, and I'm going to encourage people to either post in the Q&A, to post in the chat, or to raise your hand as a panel, as an attendee, and let us know if you've got a question or something to share. Particularly would be of interest to hear from folks who are striving and thriving. If there are lessons that haven't necessarily been shared here, insights you could provide that you're interested in sharing about what's working in your agency, also what you may be struggling with. But certainly, if there are any initial questions from anyone who is attending today, please let us know.